Hello, everyone. Welcome to Risen Champions League Playoffs Round 1. It's time. It's finally here. I am Paul. Please be joined by Dylan Kleinman and Beatdown Boulevard, the toughest street in town. Fellas, we've got an awesome game win tonight here between Just Randoms and LSU. And I mean, I've been chomping at the bit to get into the playoffs, and it's finally here.
Yeah, I mean, finally, after 6 weeks of pretty intense play, these teams are actually making it into the playoff stage. It is only week one. We've got plenty of weeks coming ahead of us with the whole double bracket, the double elimination. Should be a lot of fun, getting started in week one.
Yeah, definitely will be excited to really get this thing going. We already have a pretty good matchup going on tonight, and it's honestly just going to get better from here. I'm super excited to get things going. I think, Paul, are we going to talk about the standings first?
Yes, sir. Yeah, so we'll slap those up on the screen. Mr. K said on production tonight. Boom, look at that, baby. Looking good. We got a couple of 6-0 teams. You're going to see one of them tonight and Just Randoms. But guys, hey, look at Group D. I mean, we're not seeing anyone from them, but that ended up stacked.
Yeah, Group D was actually really even. I mean, one thing that you and I were talking about a little bit, Paul, just now is there were 3-0-6 teams at the end of the season. I mean, that's pretty surprising. When I played
Yeah.
in my split of Risen Champions last split in the spring, I I think there was maybe one, maybe two, but I mean 3-0-6 teams, tough for them, but two 6-0 teams, and luckily we get to watch one of them tonight. Arguably the better team in Just Randoms.
Yeah, that's right. And it is going to be pretty interesting to see how that matchup does play out. And hold on. Did my internet just go out? Are we still here?
You are still here,
I'm still
thankfully.
here. You love to see it. But yeah, as you said, it is good that we still had, even though we had some unfortunate showings for some teams, we do have some really solid teams tonight. And LSU, they are definitely going to be a powerhouse team and a team you probably, I think, fair to say, a favorites going into the playoffs.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, for me, one of the things that stood out too, even those 6-0 teams, I mean, Dylan, you mentioned the 0-6, but even the 6-0 is like, I think it's even it's hard to say which is more impressive, right? Losing on them or winning on them. But I think it's really impressive winning on them because, like, at a certain point, you think you'd let up eventually or just have a bad pick or things like that. Or even you mentioned like LSU last week. I know we'll get into it a little bit as we talk about tonight's game. But LSU had a DC and ended up still winning. Like, even the 6-0 teams, you'd expect some kind of weird gaff to happen. But to be able to pull that off, I think really sort of sets the expectations for us tonight and
Yeah.
where we think, just randoms as the 6-0 team could be really strong.
Yeah, it shows, the team has resilience. You don't become 6-0 by, a fluke or anything like that. You're playing over multiple patches against multiple opponents. You very clearly deserve your score of 6-0, especially, with the fact that Risen's not best of one, it's best of three, right? So you're not,
Mhm.
cheating best of one wins in, off some backdoor or something. No, like you're really proving your worth here. So a 6-0 team coming into playoffs should automatically be a favorite for everybody. And the fact that Just Randoms is such a stacked roster just kind of adds to the fact that it's hard to predict against them.
Yeah, that's completely fair. I do want to bring up what I said when we talked about this. Was again, they had the composition that outscaled. Okay, it was a 4v5, but they had a level 16 Cassidon. So at least if we bring up this context, it somewhat makes a little bit more sense. But I definitely do agree with you. It does goes to show they have great team fighting, even though they like to draft kind of biasly towards late game scaling. If they get out of that early laning phase, which they consistently seem to do unscathed, like they just can't lose.
Yeah, and that's the thing. Ultimately, for me at least, too, I want to see LSU be able to put up a really good fight game one because tonight's only a best of three. We'll get as we get into playoffs, we'll start seeing more best of fives. But I mean, in order to get there, have any chance, I mean, they've got to have at least a showing that gives them some confidence, right? Like they've got to pull a rabbit out of the hat, or do something at least at minimum to make JR uncomfortable.
Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, you're not sure, a loss tonight doesn't spell the end of your season in Risen, but if you get 2-0'd in fast fashion, it's not going to go well for you, right? You're going to have no confidence going into next week. And I mean, you want to see them at least get a game in this series. If they could win the series, that's huge, right? JR's not out of the tournament then, but taking down a
Mm-hmm.
tournament favorite in the first round is certainly something to be proud of. But my goal for LSU tonight is one game. If they can get one game, I think we can call it a W.
Yeah, absolutely. And honestly, if they end up beating a tournament favorite, even though you're happy with that alone, I feel like they could actually make a pretty good run into the later parts of the tournament bracket. Because it's obviously LSU will surprise us if they do it, but then they'll show us that they are capable of playing even better than we could have imagined, and that alone could take you to a surprising finals appearance.
Yeah, and there's a host of other exciting games. We'll see if we can get the results for you as the audience, as we go through the evening and see what we can do. But first, we've got a really exciting prediction here. We'll be kicking to Mazel and Smacks in just a bit for their predictions. But we've got Jack Go for Reno and his good friend Zuki with a special video.
All right, we now have our predictor in. Zuki, pizza. All right, we have a definitive prediction for hashtag LSU, and it looks like. Hello all, welcome to some hashtag pet predictions for the Risen Champs League. This is playoffs week number 1. On the left, we have just randoms, and on the right, we do have LSU. I'm going to be having my dog Zuki do the predictions here. Whichever piece of pizza crust she decides to eat first will be the winner for this week. So let me get our predictor on out here. Zuki, come on. Come on, Gooey. Come on, yes. Let's get you inside. Come on, Zuki. Come on. No. Come on, girlie. There we go. Alright, we now have our predictor in. Zuki, pizza. Alright, we have a definitive prediction for hashtag LSU, and it looks like.
Welcome to the caster desk for the evening, ladies and gentlemen. I am Mazel, and I'm joined by Smacks, and I am so excited for this series, but even more excited for the big brain picks that we just saw from Zuki. I want to appreciate Reno and Co for the picks, and LSU apparently going to take the dub.
Yeah, special shout out to Zuki there. Not a very popular ship couple from Avatar: The Last Airbender, Zuko and Suki, but to each their own. Yeah, very smart dog right there predicting Louisiana State. I have gone and done the same, London. This may come as a surprise to everyone, but I'm agreeing with the dog. I think that this is a huge brain prediction from Zuki, and nobody else thinks so.
We get the graphic up here to look at the predictions for the moment, and it's very one-sided. But you get the one person and Zuki who went for LSU. I'll have to see if they can show up on the day of it. You see on the other side of the bracket, or the other side of the predictions, everybody is TBA. So very interesting matchups for the kickoff of the playoffs, and I'm so excited to see if LSU can really give it to just randoms.
Yeah, predicting for the content victory. You can only go so far with that one. I am a lot for TBA, but honestly, I'm pretty surprised that nobody else deviated even a little bit. But that just goes to show that these two teams playing on the day, TBA and our featured matchup here, just randoms, are pretty dominant, and they were in the regular season as well. TBA going 5-1, and just randoms undefeated across 6 weeks of gameplay.
And maybe they continue the streak. Maybe they have the dream of a season here, but it starts off with the first round of playoffs, and we will get to that here shortly. But I do want to take a moment of silence and let Smacks take over the eulogy for the teams that will no longer be with us.
All right, everyone. If you could all raise a salute to the teams that have fallen in the Risen Championship League. I'm going to sing this an octave lower. Or for you, I'm doing this for you because if I did it the right octave, then you all would click off of the stream. So here we go. Yo, there's nothing after you, and I know that my heart will go on.
All right, so sad.
And that goes out to the 8 teams that did not make it to the playoffs. So
a big shout
I hope you're feeling good about that one. Of course, it was a pretty rough 6 weeks, all
It
leading
was.
up to not just barely not making it for a few teams. There were a few
Yeah.
tiebreakers, but
You
we
gotta
gotta move on. We gotta move on to the playoffs.
you got
Our
to.
hearts will
Life
go on.
Our hearts will go on, and life does move on. But speaking of moving on, you don't have to hear our craziness anymore. We're gonna send it to the analyst desk to break down the draft for you for game number 1, and you'll see those pretty faces in just a moment.
Oh, well, sorry, everybody. Welcome back. We're getting ready here for a draft in just a second. I'm Paul with Beatdown and Dylan once again, and super excited to get into this one. And we were looking through sort of the drafts of the last few, and JR has sort of been running the same things throughout the season. But before tonight's matchup, I know you two were diving into a lot of LSU. What sort of things are we looking for tonight?
So, in my opinion, when looking at LSU, as Beatdown was kind of outlining, you want to see this team pick comfort and you want to see them pick kind of towards the late game because, just looking at the rosters on paper, it is a little bit evident that these two teams do not stack up in terms of individual skill very closely, right? When you look at JR, it's a lot of high challenger players that have been around the amateur scene or the collegiate scene for some even years at this point. Whereas LSU, sure they have some big names on their team, but they're not quite up there in terms of individual prowess. They're much more like a cohesive team unit that you want to see hit the late game. They're very good at team fighting. And if they can get to that point, they can actually put up a fight. But I am a little worried about them being able to get to that point. So we're going to have to keep our eye out for the early and mid game to see if they can kind of weather the storm that is, the Captain Shrimp's War Machine Hyper jungle mid duo.
Yeah, I gotta say I share your concern there because the problem does end up being it's okay to draft for late game and try to just get through the laning phase and wait for your big late game power spikes. That's fine. The problem is when you have to lane against the likes of JR, who you just highlighted, are if we just look pound for pound, JR is better than LSU and all of their players. So in that situation, if you leave yourself vulnerable in the laning phase, these players are good enough that they can just take the lead, run away with it, and never stop. So LSU are going to be really careful with how they actually draft going into game 1 here, because if they do completely rely on the late game team fighting, they're going to really struggle through that early game, and that's what they're gambling on too.
Yeah, no, I mean, I completely agree. It's going to basically come down to whether or not JR can actually put the pedal to the metal in this game, because it's clear that, based off their last few compositions that they've ran the last few weeks that they've played, they're very good at snowballing the early game, right? They love Nidalee jungle, they love Graves jungle, they love things like the Rumble mid, the Twisted Fate mid, things that can kind of get the game going early. And if they pick champions like that, I think it's not really going to be all too close of a series. We'll have to see how they perform on the day, but it's going to be scary.
Yeah, and I think the other thing too, I think we've actually done JR in one of these casts before too. If not, we've watched them pretty closely, and yeah, they're just such a monster team in the early game, and their picks are pretty. I don't want to say standard because that seems to like limit how clever it actually is. But they play so aggressively and so well with some of you mentioned the Graves into like some of their picks in the mid lane with that Rumble. They can just play so fast and so strong that I don't know if they're going to give LSU a chance, right? Like I think they can make the gamble to play aggressively and not let it get into late game a lot more easily than LSU can gamble to actually just bank on late game. You know what I mean? Like LSU can't afford to just let the whole game fly. JR can put their pedal down early and see what they can make happen.
Yep.
Yeah, and so it looks like we are going to be going into draft here in just a second. We will be starting JR. So the way it works in playoffs is the first team gets the choice based on if they're on the left side of the bracket. So Just Randoms chose to start on red, and that means next game LSU will have the choice. So it won't necessarily be that the side switch. LSU might choose to stay on blue, and then they'll alternate on who gets to choose in each respective draft. But to LSU, this is, I think, really important that they get this B1, and we can dive into it as we get through the draft. But having the opportunity to get that first pick here, and I think set sort of the stage and the momentum from themselves is really going to be important.
Yeah, I mean, I think having blue side for LSU is probably a good thing, right? Because, champions like Samira have popped up as potential B1 picks. Graves is always something that's been contested in that B1 position. We'll see. In the last few weeks, LSU has favored that Samira in the first pick. We'll see if JR has done their homework and if they ban it, or maybe they just don't feel like they have to, right? Maybe they feel like, the Senna Leona, Senna Braum answer is good enough for it. If I were JR, I would probably just ban it, because why lose a game to a worse team off of just like, a snowball coin flippy kind of champion? But as we're diving into draft, we'll be able to see what these teams have done in terms of prep for the series.
Yes, things are finally underway. We talked about it. I'm curious to see what LSU are going to prioritize ending up on the blue side. I agree they're probably going to look for that Samira, as they've definitely been able to do some work with it, but I'm also curious to see what they want to get rid of, what they want to take off the board. So far, it's looking like they banned Camille. JR are going to respond that with the Tryndamere ban. I got to imagine that's targeted. And LSU, Camille, super strong right now, actually gave them a lot of trouble in a previous game as well. Not surprised they just want to take it off the table.
So interesting. That's so strange. I mean, maybe
Yeah.
did you guys see any of that in LSU's work, or is JR sort of trolling with that?
Yeah, I don't know.
Really
That Tryndamere ban's weird. Maybe it was, a lost ban, or maybe they just felt like they didn't have anything to ban. In terms of solo queue and what I've seen in their past weeks, Tryndamere's not popped up anywhere. But the Ornn has. The Ornn is something that it makes sense, right? When you're playing up against a worse team, why would you not ban champions that are kind of like crutch champions, right? You think of like Ornn, you think of Shen, you think of, other champions, maybe some enchanter supports. Get them off the table, right? Because it's not like you're not outskilling somebody on Ornn. You're out macroing them. You're out, you're outscaling them. And if you can take those champions off the board, I think it makes a lot of sense. Samira is still up as a first pick option for LSU.
They gotta grab it.
I think
they have to.
I think they do. I don't think you can let that champion slip through. And one important thing to note is that LSU has flexed the Samira into the mid lane. Now, it did result in a loss, and they actually let it through, huh?
Interesting. And I say interesting with a little bit of cynicism, but I would have done it there. And maybe the Lily is what they want in terms of pacing and some early jungling, like the ability to just steal and set them back even further, seeing that the Graves is off the board for JR even. But I really would have liked to see the Samira there.
Yeah, I mean, my thought process is maybe they're giving up the Samira, right? Because here's kind of the mind game that happens in draft. JR thinks that LSU is going to first pick Samira. As soon as they don't first pick it, well, then JR starts getting in their head, okay, if they're not going to first pick Samira, they clearly want us to pick it, and they probably have a plan, right? So they don't want to fall into that trap. Instead, they just pick the Jhin. They keep things stock standard for short hop. Honestly, a very strong champion. We've seen it pop up at Worlds more and more. And the Shen first pick is something I really like. UWO Chim, the top laner of this team, he's not really the carry, right? In the last couple of weeks, he's played Camille, but you could argue that's because it's up against, Team Fish Taco, who did end up going 0-6. In the games where they were up against much closer opponents, he has just been picking tanks, things like Ornn, things like Shen. It's just such a strong blind pick. You can't really go wrong with Shen top.
Yeah, that's right. And it's looking like LSU actually don't want to pick the Samira at all unless they do opt for the mid, which I kind of hope we don't see, to be honest. But Caitlyn is going to be the pick. Kind of expecting they just immediately pick Lux or Morgana for a really strong laning phase. You guarantee you have a pushing lane. Leona's fine too. Still have an option for some setups where you stun into trap, into a whole lot of damage, and having a pushing lane is going to be really nice for this Lilia. Can safely try and contest those scuttle crabs, and maybe even go for an invade.
Yeah, I think the Leona is very interesting here. It's a little bit weird in terms of... I get it because, it makes Jhin take cleanse, right? Because Jhin has no dash to escape the, the long-range solar flare. The Sylas I do like, although it's a little bit wonky that they're picking it here, unless, of course, they're going to flex that Shen between top and jungle. Maybe even support, that isn't out of the question. I think it's safe to assume that this is Sylas mid. Oh, actually, we're getting word it's Kha'Zix. So that Sylas is Kha'Zix. Interesting.
That Stylus would have made a ton of sense. Like, I'm looking at my notes. I literally have Captain Shrimp dash Stylus. So
Yeah.
That would have made a ton of sense. Honestly, I wouldn't be surprised if we actually do see them go. Never mind, it's Hecarim.
Okay. Well, it's been
shout
changed
out-
a couple of times.
Shout out to our
Okay.
observer.
Yeah.
Thank you, Sam.
Shout outs the
Shen Hecarim
amateur
is nice.
scene.
Yeah,
Shen
seriously.
Hecarim is very nice.
Yeah, it's like kind of the bread and butter combo. You know, the Shen Hecarim, you can kind of throw everything over the top. Often you see it paired with something like a Jhin or a Senna that can kind of assist from far, doesn't really need peel. So it makes a lot of sense. In terms of picks here, you know, assuming that's Shen Hecarim in the top and jungle, you're probably just looking at a support here, right? Something that matches up well into Leona. Braum's not bad, Nautilus is not bad. You could also maybe go something like Morgana and put it on, you know, the Hecarim to kind of prevent him from being locked down. Interesting to see what Pocus goes for here. Rakan is also definitely an option. You know, it kind of, instead of being more solely focused on engage, Rakan is a bit more of both. You know, he can peel and he can go in there and actually, you know, get in the midst of things with the Hecarim Shen. So I actually do really like the Rakan here.
Yeah, it is pretty solid, and it is looking like they're going to save their... What pick is it? They do have that last counter pick, and my brain is farting.
So that would be
It's the
mid lane
top-
because that Stylus ends up being Hecarim.
Oh,
Yeah,
that's
yeah,
right.
it'd be
I'm looking at the
mid lane
Silas
counter
like,
pick.
wait.
It's so confusing.
So it is
It's
mid lane
so
counter pick.
confusing.
You're right. I have already forgotten. And LSU are
It's
actually
tough.
going to go with the it is. They're gonna go with the Renekton as well. Solid, honestly, really solid top laner right now as well. It's really nice early game too, and it kind of just goes with the theme that LSU seem to be going for. It's having pushing lanes in that early game to really enable your Lilia, who is going to be very squishy early and not have as much impact.
Oh, I like so this Rise pick. I think I like it. I'm gonna defer sort of to you guys. I just want to touch on quick how much I like the Rakan for JR. Like I just think it gives them a really interesting engage tool on top of like you can Shen ultimate into the quickness and like maybe I doubt we'll actually end up seeing it because it's just more reliable to tag onto a Hecarim if he gets fed early, but that's still like another avenue that they have here if they want to go for some cheeky dives. So I wouldn't be surprised by that. And they're gonna combine with a TF. We've got a lot of movement across the map here, fellas. That's a lot of movement.
I love that last pick TF. You know, it's one of the
Mhm.
champions that's been banned away from Captain Shrimps quite a bit in this tournament. It's his fourth most played champion in solo queue. Makes a lot of sense with this kind of composition, right? If you want to make a play on the Shen in the side lane, well, TF can come back him up. If you want to make a play on TF in the side lane, well, then Shen can come back him up. And if you want to make a play on the three that are going to be in the mid lane, well, then Shen and TF can come, you know, assist them. It's honestly, they've got this really unique composition here where as soon as they can kind of break out into a 1-3-1 in the mid-late game, it seems so hard to actually break them, right? Because what's your engage when you're looking at LSU? It's a miracle Lilia ball into sleep, which is kind of negated by the fact Jhin should take cleanse. And then maybe like a max range solar flare. But other than that, like Rise and Renekton are not going to be doing anything in terms of engaging. So I think honestly, JR comes out with the W in terms of compositions. Now I do think LSU has some windows, especially in the early game. You know, you've got Leona, Renekton, Lilia. It's a very, very strong early game. But we need to see them kind of, you know, keep up with JR in terms of this global pressure that they have with Shen and TF.
And it seems like LSU are a bit drafting a bit differently than they normally do. We already were just talking about how they love to kind of sack their early game and wait until we're out of the laning phase. They can start going for the 5v5 team fights. That's when their comps usually come online. But this, like you're saying, they have a lot of early game power here. They have some scaling into that late game as well. So So they have the agency in the early game to actually give themselves a lead, and they have some, what I've heard other casters called bridging champions that they can also kind of baton pass into that later game. Because Caitlyn, 2 or 3 items is going to be insane. Rise, 2 or 3 items is going to be insane. Even the Lilia damage is going to be really good at 2 or 3 items, especially once that Leandre Stormont comes through. So there is a lot of team fighting options for the side of LSU. And at the end of the day, even though because I don't think LSU are really looking to split push too much, especially because of what they're dealing with in JR's composition. It's not really an option just because of the global presence that they have. So at the end of the day, LSU, even though this time around they did consider their early game. I think they still just want a head-to-head 5v5 team fight, and I think their comp is pretty well suited to do so.
So it's been a while since I've seen a draft where I've had an idea here where it's like level 6 is going to be so interesting, and I think really so indicative of really the pace of the game and like who's going to be really trying to take a firm hold of it, because I want to see, is Shen actually looking for a play at 6? Are we looking for TF or Rise able to get out of the mid lane and make their way across the map at 6? You finally have, you have engaged with the grand entrance with Rakan, but you're really going to go for an even harder engagement, the quickness or things like it. There's so many different ways that they can move in and move onto the other team at 6 versus other comps that for me, those first 12 minutes, sure, they might be interesting, but once we hit, right when we hit those level 6s, is going to be interesting. Or if both teams just handshake and go, you know what, we're not going to actually move. We're going to just stay in our lanes, nobody try any funny business, and we're just going to wait for the late game. And so that's what I'm really going to be keeping my eyes on.
Yeah, I think kind of laying out expectations for how this game, theoretically should go. I think LSU, they should play around topside, right? Just kind of looking pound for pound. It seems. Actually, I don't know. This Lily has a lot of angles to play from, right? She can go towards topside. She can look to aid that Renekton into the Shen. And the reason I say that is because if you look down towards bot side, well, then Shen can always use that Stand United to join the fight. So it's always hard. You usually want to target the global ultimate. But in the early game, before Shen level 6, there is a window for Lily to look down towards bot. The Jhin is very susceptible to being engaged on by Leona. So expect to see Viveri Memento have, a lot of options in the early game. Other than that, though, I feel like just randoms, if they just play around their globals, they're going to be in a very, very good spot going into this game.
Yeah, that's the thing. You talked about how the level 6 is going to be really important. That is going to be where things really start to pop off. I doubt JR are content with a handshake farming LCK style until 30 minutes into the game. So I imagine once you have those global ultimates ready to go, even the Silas with it's not Silas. Oh, god damn it, JR. It's a Hecarim. Hecarim. Thank you. The point is, a lot of global presence is going to be there, and I imagine that's something you want to take advantage of as soon as it's available. So the first TF ulti, that first Stand United, is going to be really important. Once you see those heroes, those champions hitting level 6, what's JR going to do with it, and how well are those plays actually going to work? I think that's going to be really crucial for their composition here. And I think if you're LSU, because you have more early game power, I think you play through bottom side solely because you want to grab those early game Drakes, because I feel like later on in the game, it is going to be a little hard to contest JR for them.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, right? In terms of just, stock standard 5v5, unless just randoms has a decent lead, it's going to be actually pretty hard for them to fight 5v5. The TF is going to have to find some creative angles. The Shen Hecarim is really going to have to, find access to the backline under the Caitlyn, under the Rise. It's going to be difficult to pull off, but honestly, if there's any team in this tournament that can pull off a composition like that, it is JR. So
True.
I'm looking forward to see how they play this game.
I was saying, just before, as we're wrapping up final thoughts here, Dylan, I want to ask a question specifically of you, because you have played at this level with these teams, and it's sort of this, going into playoffs in these sort of higher intensity situations. Yeah. When you're a team like LSU, like we can be as plain as one team 6-0, one team's 3-3. It doesn't take a rocket scientist to understand they're an underdog here.
Yeah.
When you're in that spot, is it really like you feel with every sort of move you make in the lane the weight of that decision, or is it something coming in that you practice and rehearse that, like, no, we're going to stick to our game plan, or is that sort of where you find out the fortitude of the team?
I think it depends a lot on the player, but for me personally, there's a lot of pressure. People like to say that, as the underdog, there's no pressure. You just get to play loose. But I'm going to be honest, a team like LSU, they want to prove that they belong in these playoffs, right? Sure, it is double elimination. It's not their last chance to show their value in these playoffs, but obviously they want to win tonight. And I feel like they probably went into this week knowing that they're the underdog and thinking about, okay, how does Just Randoms play? And what are some champions? What are some play styles that we can kind of adapt to over this week of scrims and practice that we can then implement into this series and try and, throw a curveball, right? That's probably why we didn't see Samira first pick. right? Because Samiro's a champion where if you're not confident that you're going to get the win, well, then why are you really picking it, right? If you're not going to win bot lane with Samira, there's no point in picking it. So they kind of adapted their draft to kind of, realistic expectations for how this game is going to go. And I'm really excited to see how they've changed their play style to match JR.
Yeah, it's going to be something awesome to watch out for. What we're going to do at this point is we're going to kick it to the casters, get them ready to go. So we will be hearing the beautiful voices of Mazel and Smack. On the other side of this transition, we'll be back with the post-game analysis. Enjoy the game. We'll see you after.
Welcome, everyone, and we are back at the wonderful caster desk. It's a comfortable place that me and Smacks have gotten to know well. And after that draft, Smacks, I had to get your thoughts. You had some very poignant thoughts about one particular pick here. So what do you got?
I have some thoughts. So First of all, before I go bashing this particular pick, I want to say I like what LSU their game plan is very apparent. I like what they've done with this draft. They take the Lilia, they ban 3 champions that go for early lane priority, the Camille, the Revolution. They take Lilia. They really want to get this Lilia off the ground with priority. They follow it up with Caitlyn, Leona, Renekton. I like that quite a lot. They've got a pretty nice core of early game stuff to get this Lilia rolling. And then they blind pick Rise.
Hey, it's fine. Okay, you gotta get some scaling there some way.
It's definitely less than fine. I don't know why we're lying to ourselves here, Lennon. It is not fully fine to pick this Rise blind, and they better be thanking just randoms here that Captain Shrimps didn't just take Orianna and completely stuff the lights out of them. Captain Shrimps being very gracious with his Twisted Fate pick. He absolutely could have gone for Clockwork Ball Mistress. But alas, we have Twisted Fate. And
we do.
Even with this Twisted Fate locked in, Lennon, just randoms still do have a pretty nice mid lane matchup. It's a little bit less good than it would have been if they take it with Orianna, but this early lane priority that LSU's trying to go for, this Rise is just such a big speed bump for them. I really am worried that their mid lane isn't really going to come off the ground to really help out this Lilia in the jungle.
Now, the biggest thing for me is that Hecarim, I think, is going to be very influential for LSU in bridging that a little bit for their team. Being able to get the ball rolling for them, getting this Jhin ahead, I think is going to be super important for them. We already have mentioned 1,000 times over this beginning segment here that this is an underdog story. Just randoms are coming in, top dogs, 6-0, looking to keep that undefeated series going, and Louisiana State are potentially setting themselves up to get the first punch in here, Smacks.
Yeah. And I like their game plan. They're clearly going for this early game lane dominant style, especially with this Caitlyn Leona. They want to get that going. And LSU, they've picked this Rakan into it. Leona, a known Rakan counter pick. So I feel like in the bot lane, it is going to be LSU favorite, and the top lane is pretty similar to. Of course, Shen is very difficult to break, but Renekton is the champion to do it. So I'm really excited to see how those 2 lanes in particular go for LSU. But we're gonna have to find out. As just randoms are undefeated for a reason.
And guess what? We finally made it. We have arrived at our destination as we hit Summoner's Rift for the first time of the playoffs.
And here we are. We do have the game begun, and we got Captain Shrimps. He's got his red Twisted Fate skin as well. It's a nice one. It doesn't change the part, but I really like the red. It's a nice looking skin. As we do have in the top lane, Jhin versus Renekton. As I was talking about, this matchup, it can be Renekton favored. It is really jungle dependent, and Lilia, with the added lane priority of Renekton and the Caitlyn Leona, I feel like this can start getting off the ground for Memento. It can be that snowballer for the team, and I'll say this one last time. I wish that this wasn't Rise, so it could come true, but it can still happen if we can do it.
I just wish it's like you didn't get what you wanted for Christmas, Smacks. It was
not
the Rise you wanted. It was something completely different. I'm cautious about this Rise pick. I think I agree with a lot of what you're saying, but I want to see how it turns out on the day and how Rufio can really try something here and potentially answer Captain Shrimps, because he is going to be a driving force on this squad.
Yeah, he definitely is. He's got the Swift's Fate. He's got the spell book. So as soon as it does get out of that laning phase, once he hits that level 6, he is going to be a threat no matter where you
Yeah.
are. Now for LSU, they do still have to be, they can rest on their laurels in the side lanes against this Twisted Fate because they do have push priority with these champions if they choose to use it. So they are in a pretty alright defensive position if they want to go for it. But it is still destiny. You can still get caught off guard very, very easily by that ability. And the Stand United to come on through too. All of a sudden, you are outnumbered in a fight that you were winning.
So I want to pick your brain a little bit. Your brain is so much larger than mine. What is the biggest driving factor in picking up the spellbook now, and why has it taken so much priority, especially for the likes of like a TF mid?
Well, for Twisted Fate, you don't really have a rune that you really enjoy using.
Okay.
You can go for like Fleet, I guess, to help out in the lane, but this isn't really a lane where you need that. You're not getting poked down very hard by those eyes. If it was a more pokey champion than this Twisted Fate, then maybe you'd see a Fleet, but usually not necessary at all.
Yeah.
You can just take that spell, but to feel a little bit more powerful as the game goes on. You've got a lot of options. You can go for cleanse as he does have in this matchup.
Yeah.
And get rid of that root.
The flexibility, at least, is the biggest pull there. And especially, like you said, I think it's interesting when you don't have a particular rune that just stands out to you, the keystone that means that you have to take it every time. And it's interesting to see the evolution in that. And speaking of evolution, we might get a little early skirmish here. You do have Captain Shrimp roaming down, but it is the bot lane who makes it first to help out Memento. They will acquire the first Scuttlecraft.
And that fight's definitely going to favor LSU with the Caitlyn and Leona. So War Machine Hyper, very wise to back away from that one. No globals are available yet. You cannot Stand United as Shen is level 4. That would be monster broken. So
Yeah, well.
not quite going to be available yet.
But when it does, oh, speaking of, oh my God, first blood going over and Yukio picks it up. That's not what we were expecting. And then Timmy Turner in the top side takes his own. That is 2-0 already for LSU, and you've got to be feeling real good in that prediction already early on, Smack.
Lennon, that's going to feel very, very nice. We didn't actually notice it before, but Timmy Turner actually got a nice recall off before going to that fight to pick up that cull. So he had 2 starter items on the play, picking up a solo kill onto Chim. That's going to feel pretty nice.
You do see a kerfuffle going down, but Ghost is going to be popped by War Machine Hyper to make sure he can get out of there, and nothing going to come of it. But I like what you mentioned. It's those little minute decisions that mean so much, and it truly came out on top for Timmy Turner this time around. It probably didn't have the biggest influence on that fight, but that extra damage definitely helps.
And again, we're seeing the early game come to fruition for LSU, getting 2 early kills, not even needing their bot lane. I'm really surprised. This is a bit of a high roll for them. I feel they're feeling really good. This isn't even where their power is. But now Yukio, he gets to come back to lane with his tier already complete. He's going to be scaling up very early in this matchup, where otherwise he wouldn't really be doing so. But that early kill, that first blood even against Captain Shrimps, that's exactly what you want as this early game runs.
And getting that extra gold, getting to those item breakpoints earlier on is going to be huge for them. And oh no, Aaron is going to be stopped on the back. So Short Hop comes out on top with that. Gets the Swifties, gets a dagger as well. Going to have that extra little bit of attack speed with those extra damage on the shot. And we'll see how that works out for them. We are going to see Aaron finally get that back off here.
That's not really a recall that you want for Short Hop on this Jhin. That tells you that you had 1,200 gold, just shy of the BF sword. And Aaron, he's the one who stayed around a little bit longer. He picked up that extra wave. He gets that reward of the BF sword. So he's going to be even stronger in that lane. Even though he's behind in CS right now, that extra AD is going to feel very